My name is Yoonmee Cho. I am one of the co-leads of our justice ministry with Hee-kyung sitting right here in the front. We're really happy and honored to have our special guest with us and Pastor Jean here to talk about why voting matters, but specifically why voting matters to us as Christians. So before we get started, I do just want to do a brief introduction of our guest speakers. So to my right here, we have Cidra Sebastien. She is an auntie, educator, organizer, and member of Renaissance Church, New York City. She has developed arts and activism curricula, published op-eds about the possibilities for youth leadership development and the impact of immigration policies on young people. She's appeared on radio and television outlets and contributes to local and national policy making about investing in the advancement of young people. Cidra is an avid runner and reader whose imagination is fueled by the arts, travel, and learning from others. We also have with us Grace Choi in the purple sweater here. She's the founder and CEO of Charis Consulting Group, a national consulting firm that provides community organizing, strategic advising, and coalition building support for Asian organizations to empower the voice and capacity of the community. Grace is a community strategist and political leader with over 15 years of experience in community organizing, policy, advocacy, diplomacy, international development, and the list goes on. So we're really very lucky to have the two of them here with us to speak about their experiences regarding voting and the importance of voting. Plus we have Pastor Jean, who needs no introduction, hopefully, for those that are in the church community here. We are really going to try to just have like a conversation amongst our speakers here today to talk about really the baseline question of, does my vote matter? Why does it matter? How does it matter? And especially to us as Christians, as I mentioned. So to kick things off, I'm going to pass it to Pastor Jean first. So we often hear about why we should be voting in our secular lives. Could you open us up by speaking to why we should vote and why voting matters to us as Christians in particular?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for listening to something really important. And this is something that we've talked about in our Faith and Politics series. We talked about, do Christians have an obligation to vote? And that's a question that we have asked. And I think there are fair arguments on both sides of it. But one thing I did want to talk about, I did want to read a short passage for us from Romans 13. And what we have in Romans 13 is maybe one of the most political passages that we see in Scripture. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Okay. Oops. All right. It's reading it. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is Romans 13. I just want to read a few verses. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So what we see in this passage is the Christian's relationship to the governing authorities. And we have to note that Paul is writing to Christians in the first century who are living in the Roman Empire. And I know a popular TikTok trend right now is for women to ask men, how often do you think of the Roman Empire? Paul is writing to Christians who are living in the Roman Empire, and he's telling them, be subject, submit to the governing authorities. Now, the Roman Empire was known particularly for its violence and brutality. It was, they consolidated power, and they kind of stamped out all kind of opposing viewpoints. And that was the context in which he says, submit to the governing authorities. Now, I have heard this passage in particular, these verses, quoted by a lot of Christians in America. And they've said, just as the Bible says, that we also should submit to our governing authority. So what's interesting is I hear people say this particularly when their guy is in office or their party's in power, right? You need to submit. So if you are a Republican and it's a Republican majority, a Republican person in office, then say you tell everyone else, hey, you need to submit as Christians. And if a Democrat is in office, I've heard Christians also use this term as well and say, these verses as well and say, see, you should submit. But I think one thing we have to realize is that the Roman Empire and our current American political system are very, very different. Right? The Roman Empire, the emperor consolidated power to himself. He had absolute authority, but we live in a democratic republic. Okay? Where is the power? It's not consolidated in the presidency or the monarchy. The power is in the people. The people wield the power. We don't call our leaders public leaders. We call them public servants. So as Christians, when we hear these verses, submit to the governing authorities, it's not submit to your elected officials. In a very real sense, we are the governing authority. So it's not that we need to submit to the President of the United States, but we need to submit to the system. Right? Our Constitution, it doesn't begin, thus saith the king. It says, we the people, because that is where the power is. So what is our obligation when we look at Romans 13? It's to wield power well. It's not to submit, it's to submit to the system. So what does that mean? How do we exercise power? Well, we see in these verses that the whole point of government is to protect and provide for the people. It's for the well-being, it's to safeguard the well-being of the people. So we have a responsibility as those who are in power to submit to the system. How do we wield power well? And I think a very clear answer is exercise the vote. Ensure that the right people are in office. So I think the point of this is not for us to say who you should vote for, or here are the issues you should vote for. But I think as Christians, I think civic engagement is an obligation that the Bible does lay out for us. We don't live in a monarchy. We don't live in the Roman Empire. We are the people who are in charge. Our elected officials represent us. So I think as Christians, we have an obligation to the entire country to exercise that power well, and I think the way to do that is the vote.
Great, thank you so much, Pastor Jean. So following up with that, now that we know that this is why we as Christians should be voting, we thought it'd be really helpful to have Grace and Cidra here to talk us through kind of like how we can then do that. So Cidra, I'll turn to you first. You've had a lot of experience in community organizing and advocacy around voting rights in particular. Could you please share with us some of those experiences with us and what you've learned from them so that folks here who may be first-time voters or it's been a while since they voted have an idea of what to expect maybe when they show up at their voting centers?
Yeah, thank you. I had to take notes because I love that, right? To wield power well. And I think that's a great summary of what we can take from that passage in Romans. But as far as my experience around voting, it's really been with young people. And so for about 20 years, I worked directly with young people and families uptown in Harlem, mostly in the Heights. And one of my favorite and most interesting conversations would be when they were like 16, 17 years old, was around voting, right? And depending on what a young person's circumstance was, they might not be eligible to vote. And not just because they're not yet 18, but maybe they're not a US citizen. Maybe there's a disinterest in voting, right? Because of what they might have experienced or what people in their homes and their families may have experienced in other countries that they grew up in and lived in, right? Where voting was something that had a really, it wasn't only difficult to vote, but there would be persecution for voting, right? And so there were some young people who that was a part of their family history, right? Being from another country where folks who were voted were seen as like horrible troublemakers that needed to be shut down. Folks who were organizing communities to vote, that they needed to be shut down, right? But then also for folks who have roots here in the States, having folks in their families, not way back when, but who can recall moments when they went to vote and they were turned around from voting, right? And so those things that we learn about US history are really real for our young people, right? That they come from a family where they have people alive still who can say, yeah, I remember going to vote in this state and being told that I couldn't, or being told, well, if I did, that my name would appear inside of the local newspaper so that my employer would know that I went to vote. And that would be a deterrent, right? And so that is a real experience, right? I think a very real experience for young folks too is like, well, does it even matter, right? How is voting gonna make a difference? Why should I put this on my list of things to do? You know, like I'm really excited to get a driver's license. I'm really excited to go away to school and get out of New York. But why should voting be on the list of things that I get really excited about when I turn 18? And I think often that's when I kind of turn to like what it means for their day-to-day, right? Like not so much what will happen on a federal level, right? Because sometimes that can feel really broad and kind of above their thinking of like how it relates to them, but to talk about like things that are happening in their neighborhood and how voting can make a change, right? So if you're frustrated about, for example, your high school experience, maybe you went to a school in a neighborhood of lots of schools that were consistently underfunded. Maybe there's abandoned buildings in your neighborhood and nobody's taking care of them. Maybe there are different issues that are coming to mind that you really can't understand what the solution is for. Well, having them understand the role of a city council member, having them to understand the role of the speaker, having them to understand the role of the mayor, and how getting the right people in office who will wield power well is what they need in order to really have their communities and their schools be what they want it to be. And so anytime I'm talking with young people or folks who are new to vote, I try to get them to understand like how it will have a direct impact in their day-to-day. And of course, the big picture, because the big picture things can really impact our day-to-day as well. But really have people to understand like what is the connection between voting and how their life will shift because of how they voted or how others in their community vote.
Great, thanks so much, Cidra. That's really helpful. So then, once people have an understanding of like why it's important to vote, how it affects their day-to-day, can you talk us through a little bit of like the logistics of, okay, how do I register to vote? How do I check to see if I'm registered to vote? What can I expect when I get to the polling site? How do I find my polling site? You know, things like that.
Yes, okay, so maybe it's just me, but one of the things that I always wanted to do was to be a poll worker. Is it just me? So I got a chance, listen. I got a chance to be a poll worker, and it took a while for me to be able to do it, not because it's difficult or anything like that, but I would go to vote often, and I grew up going to vote with my parents. I'm like very giddy about this, and I remember growing up and going into the poll site, and there was like this big green refrigerator with a red lever, and my dad would let me like pull it over so that he could hit his notches, and we pulled it back in the other direction so that, you know, the cast could go through. So if you're in a district where they still have the big green refrigerators, we should talk about that, because there's a whole different system now. But as a kid, that was like the cool thing to do, right? And I didn't think of it as like my parents are teaching me a lesson in this moment. It was like, we don't got no child care, we gotta go vote, so everybody's coming, and then we'll make our way home, right? But it was a big experience to me. And for me, the cool people in the room were the poll workers. They had like all this info. They were the folks who I would see like in the neighborhood, and I was like, oh my gosh, this just looks so cool. They're like giving people the paper and telling them to stand there and letting them know they can move. Like, it just seemed like this whole thing to me. And so as I got older and realized that there's a lot of other things that go along with being a poll worker, it still interests me. It didn't turn me away.
Yeah. True local nerd. I love it.
Oh my gosh. And so the year that I got to be a poll worker, for me, it was really cool because it was an opportunity to do what I saw other folks doing. But it was also this realization that, at least in my neighborhood, a lot of our poll workers were much older. And it was one of the things that kind of concerned me because it was also like right at the top of the pandemic shutdown. And I was like, okay, what does it mean for us to be in a situation where so many people in my district are older, are having their own challenges managing the impact of COVID-19, but are also older and might not be around to actually be an effective poll worker anymore, right? And so it was also something that I like openly talked to friends about, like, hey, I'm gonna be a poll worker, like I know, but like check it out and see if it's something that you wanna give your time to do as well. And so I think in part to, to get people excited about the process is to just make sure that they have all the information that they need, especially if they're a first-time voter or they haven't voted in a while and they're not sure about like what the experience is going to be, right? So I think one of the cool additions to voting specifically in New York and New Jersey that have in common that's a great thing is early voting, right? And so you used to vote like on anybody remember? First Tuesday of November, right? And so now there are 9 additional days that you can go vote, which includes 2 weekends. So if you're somebody who has like a particular kind of work schedule, you have 9 days that you can select from, so you just don't go on that general Tuesday, which is awesome, and also lots of other places have been doing that before. Yeah. And so it's interesting that, again, the shutdown kind of like pushed us to make this available, right? And so now you have 10 days that you could potentially go and cast your vote in person. There also have been some shifts in New York City around like getting an absentee ballot, right? Usually absentee ballot was like you're absent from your polling station, but now it can be like you're ill. You're not able to get childcare. And so that's what's gonna make you absent from going to cast a ballot. And so you can request an absentee ballot and fill that out. And so there have been some like cool things that have come into play to allow for more people to be able to vote during a voting session, and then also to make voting accessible. So for example, if you or somebody that you know is not fluent in English and is fluent in another language, they can bring somebody with them who is fluent in English to the poll site. As long as that person is not their employer or not a union representative, they can come with that person to help them navigate literally getting into the building, going to the poll site, and doing what they need to do to cast their ballot.
It can be the interpreter.
It can be, yeah, they can be their interpreter to help them go through the process.
Yeah, and just briefly on that note, so I see some of you guys have the handout that Hee-Young beautifully created for us. There's a link there, a QR code with various different links that have resources as well for you all. So in terms of like the deep dive logistics, those resources are there and available for you all as well. And we do have the links up here to register to vote in case you haven't. You can do it right here and now. We won't be offended if you are doing that on your phone. But thanks, Cidra, for talking through a little bit of that. I think that's helpful also for folks here. So we want everyone here to be voting, but we also want to be encouraging those around us to vote. So I think this is why we're talking about some of these topics, as you may want to share that with parents, relatives, friends, coworkers, anyone, about kind of the resources that are available to them as people go out to vote. And Cidra, I know like we talked about this like a bit, but you know, you mentioned why it might affect us on our day-to-day, like why it matters to vote. Pastor Jean talked about why it matters for voting as Christians, but could you also talk a little bit too, you mentioned before there are some folks that can't vote for various different reasons, so could you speak a little bit to the importance of us who can vote, voting, why that matters too?
Yeah, for sure. So there could be people who are not eligible to vote for different reasons, right? So age is one of them, citizenship is another one. And specifically when I think about citizenship, I think about the current migrant crisis that we're experiencing here in New York City. There are tens of thousands of people who need for us to vote in the right way to make sure that their best interests are accounted for, they're not eligible to vote. They're likely not going to be eligible to vote in this country for some time, right? Again, I often think about young people in my community, in my family, who are not eligible to vote. I think about folks who have recently incarcerated, have been released, but have not yet been able to have their voting rights restored. That in itself is a process, it's not automatic. So once you've been incarcerated and you come out in New York and New Jersey, there's still steps that you need to do in order to have your rights restored so that you can vote. So there are lots of reasons that folks might not be able to vote. Somebody who is unable to actually get to a voting site, somebody who is ill, somebody who elder care is a real thing, and so they actually don't have the time or the means to leave their elder at home so that they can go vote, even that they have the 10 days that they'll be able to vote. So there are lots of different folks that we are voting for, whether we realize it or not, and not like the generation to come, but like immediately right now, folks in our community who are not able to vote that we get to vote on behalf of.
And just to add to that, that's why early voting is so important, and also absentee ballots, because then people who are sick or elderly who are not able to go to the polling locations themselves in person, they can request a paper document for voting to be delivered to their home, and then they can mail it back to the polling location so that their vote counts. And then early voting allows for a stretch of time when people who are working or don't have the 9 to 7 o'clock at night just on a Tuesday, random Tuesday, to go vote, to have more opportunities to have somebody take them with an interpreter or just be more accommodating. So these are ways that it's allowing for more accessibility to voting and kind of safeguarding against voter suppression tactics, which is what you're referring to. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, that also makes me think, like, as Pastor Jean is talking about us exercising our voices, we as Christians, I think, it makes me think, like, we want our voices to be heard too, right? Like, we don't want just, other voices out there kind of, directing what's being done out there. And so it makes me think even more so, like, we as Christians, it's important for us to vote because our values are based in what we believe in our faith and with God, and we want that out there kind of in the world too, as we're kind of making these decisions. Cidra, I'll probably come back to you in a bit, but I might actually hop over to Grace at this point. So let's say we're registered to vote now, right? Everyone here is registered to vote, or they will shortly based off of our links that are up here. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how we can become an informed voter? So, like, okay, we know who we are as Christians and in our faith, but I don't know. I don't know what these different positions are. I don't know what these different propositions are. I don't know how to navigate this. How do I inform myself so that I'm making the best decisions as I go to cast my vote?
That's a good question. And just going back to Cidra's point about how voting affects our everyday lives, whether it's locally, statewide, or federally, as Asian American Christians, I think it's really exciting to see all of y'all here and the pastor here being part of the panel, and Yoonmee and Hee-young leading this, because I think, like Yoonmee, you were saying, the Asian American Christian voice is really lacking in representing why, as Christians, our voices matter and the policy will be affected by our faith and how we decide at the polling location. So just to backtrack a little bit, my husband, Trevor Akatsuma, and I, for those who were here last year, I mentioned that we founded the New York chapter for the Coalition of Asian American Churches that came out of the Atlanta shootings on March 16th. And this is to get more Asian American churches civically engaged, more Asian American pastors and lay people to be civically engaged and have a voice in the public square. And I think some things that have come out of that are really relevant to the day-to-day policy and the program services that government provides that is affected by you voting is some of our Chinatown-based churches during the height of the pandemic and anti-Asian racism, they had mentioned that there was a number of folks who are homeless and under the influence who were actually scaring their older grandmothers and grandfathers who were trying to go to church from going to church. and they would also like defecate in front of the church. They would actually like, it would be kind of a dangerous place for elderly people to go to church. And so when we learned about that, we were like, did you already connect with the local government, with the mayor's office? Because the mayor's office can coordinate with not only NYPD, but for public safety reasons, to have some surveillance if something escalates to violence. But also they can coordinate with the Department of Social Services so that people can be housed in safe housing situations. But churches are not connected all the time to the local infrastructure of government. And I think when you know what's happening in your own neighborhood, in your own church neighborhood, and get connected to the local city council member, to the mayor, to Congress members, they are there to support you as public servants, as Pastor Jean mentioned. And so us having a relationship with the government is helping us, and it's also helping our neighbors. And so because we were able to connect the Chinatown Church to the mayor's office, they were able to find a public safety solution and also to protect the people who are mentally not well and also houseless. And so this is why voting matters, because who you elect as mayor, who you elect as city council, who you elect as Congress member affects the types of policies and resources that go to not only the most marginalized people in the community, but also our faith institutions, our neighborhoods, our houses, and our livelihoods. They affect the streets too, because in this Chinatown church, the sidewalks have been so cut up and broken and not addressed by the city for so long that in the winter, when it was really slippery and icy, the grandmothers and grandfathers, they would be slipping and it would be hard for them to even walk to church. And so we connect them with the mayor's office so that they could talk to the local transportation services to address the resources needed to fix the sidewalks. But if we are not connected to government, we can't advocate for our voices in our own communities. So that's just a very concrete way and reason for why it's so important, I think, for churches to be engaged, and like Asian American churches too, because in the mayor's office when I worked there for about 3 years, I saw Black clergy, I saw a lot of Jewish rabbis, I saw some like white Catholic priests, I saw like Asian Buddhist leaders and imams, but no Asian Christian clergy and pastors. And I was like, where are we? Because they want to, the government wants to include these different types of faith leaders and perspectives, but if we don't know how to connect, then our voices are not being addressed when it comes to the migrant solution. Like the mayor recently had a town hall and conversation in Chinatown about the migrant situation as it affects Chinatown residents, and our Asian American clergy were invited to be part of that, but it's like, oh, that's good, and they spoke up about why as Christians it's important to take care of our migrant brothers and sisters, even if this current administration might be a little bit more hostile to it. So I think you don't have to agree with the people who are in office, but if you're not engaged, they won't even know that you have a voice to advocate for those as Christians that we should. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was the reason of like why to vote, and to be informed is like, first of all, going to town hall, signing up for newsletters for your local elected officials. Every city council member, mayor's office, Congress member, state assembly member, they have a website where you can sign up to get email updates to know what type of resources they're giving out to the community that are free, like whether it's free COVID tests, voting resources, funding from the government, even to churches, to do youth development, like all sorts of like free resources. Following them on social media, and then people who are running for office who are not in office yet, if you follow them on their campaign websites and get their updates and go to their town halls, go to their rallies, go to their events, you can hear and see, do their issues that they talk about when it comes like housing issues, when it comes to public safety, when it comes to loving our neighbor, does it resonate with you or not? And then that's how you become a more informed voting person. So. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
If I could jump in, I love what you're saying, Grace, because I think for a lot of us, when we think about politics, our minds automatically default to kind of the federal level, the 2024 election coming up, the Speaker of the House issue. We kind of think of politics about that, Supreme Court cases, but what you're talking about kind of on the local level is where we can have the greatest impact, where kind of I think it's really important that representation, I know you're going to talk about that soon, but it's so important, and that we can make such a difference on the local level. So I'm so glad that you're talking about that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I think it's important for folks to know that maybe aren't as involved in like the political process and things like this, why that kind of matters, right? Why it matters that us as Christians, us as Asian American Christians are giving our viewpoint as to what matters to us. Because if we're not there at the table saying that this is why this is important to us, why we should be taking care of our neighbor, if we're not expressing our values as Christians out there, then the governing political bodies don't have any reason to do that either, right? Like, if they find that no one's coming up to step forward to say, hey, this matters to me, we want to take care of these people, then they're just going to go ahead and say, nobody cares, and that's fine, right? And I think, Grace, to your point, right, these are our elected officials, right? So they are supposed to move to what we are asking them to do. So if we go and show up and say, this is what's important to us, this is what we want you to do as our elected official, that's their responsibility. And if there are voters that are coming out and that can sway who gets elected or not, they'll really listen. So there is power there, I think. So I appreciate all that you're saying. And then I do want to actually switch up the slides too. So we have a few more questions, obviously, to ask, but we do want to let folks also ask questions. So this is a Slido link. If you guys wanted to ask any questions too, feel free to pop them in. We can also let folks just kind of ask them out loud if they like, but if you want to do it anonymously, you can do that. I mean, Grace, I think you talked about this already a little bit, but maybe in particular, the representation. So as like, not everyone here is Asian American, but for those that are Asian American, seeing more faces like ours maybe on the ballots now in a way that wasn't before. Can you speak a little bit to that and why that matters? And
Yeah. Honestly, everything we learned about like the civil rights movement and voting mobilization is from the Black community and from the Black churches. Because the Black churches were like the center of civil rights movement, right? And I think that our churches that are multicultural and Asian American can really learn from the lessons from the Black church and the Black community. Sorry, what was your question again? I already lost. Like, I'm like, what was it?
well, because you were
the representation.
Right.
Okay, representation. So I think, like, just thinking of the Black churches, also having so many former pastors or current pastors. I'm not saying Reverend Al Sharpton is like the best example for all the Black Christian leaders who are in politics, but having so many Black pastors become politicians makes a difference in getting the Black community engaged. In the same way for the Asian American community in New York City in the past city council election, we've increased our Asian American city council members from 2 people to now 8 people. So that's historic. And most of them are Asian American women. And 2 of them happen to be Korean American Christian women representing in Queens. And Julie Wan, city council member who represents Western Queens, Long Island City, Sunnyside, Astoria. And then we have Linda Lee, who represents somewhere near Flushing. I forget exactly what her district is. But they're very strong Christians connected to their local churches, and they are living out their values as Christians in a public office. And because they were on the ballot and people saw their campaign literature in front of like bodegas, Korean grocery stores and restaurants and non-Korean places and bars, more Asian Americans came out to vote. More Asian Americans who were never engaged in volunteering for campaigns started to volunteer because they were like, there's someone who looks like me, and got really excited. And so I think having that kind of representation of people who are in office or running for office with our faces makes a difference in like getting people really excited. Another example, I am not a big supporter of Andrew Yang personally, but my husband is, so we have a divided household. But Andrew Yang made a huge difference when it came to the presidential election because how many Asian Americans have run for president before and spoke on the presidential debate stage? And then he ran for mayor too. So this guy was really out there, like traveling the country, and people who had, I'm not gonna, okay, I know we're being recorded, but like it really galvanized, just to be honest, like I'm not in government anymore, so whatever. The like Asian bros like really came out, and then the tech bros got really excited about Andrew Yang, who had never done anything in politics. And I was so impressed by it, because I was like, where have y'all all been? But you're coming out for Andrew Yang. So like in an interesting way, like Andrew Yang made a huge difference when it came to representation for our community. And I respect that, even if I don't agree with his policies. And so I think representation really matters, and I think we need to see more people running for office. I think we need to see more people in our community who are young at the volunteering as poll workers, because they are all retired old folks. They are like grandmas and grandpas volunteering in the polling locations on election day. You go on November 5th, coming up for election day. You look at the poll workers, they're all old people. And then Cidra. And then like, and then there's like some older Asian grandmas and aunties who are like seeing if I need language service support, because they really want to volunteer to help with like Chinese speakers or Vietnamese or Korean speakers. I'm like, no, I speak English, but I kind of want to not speak English so I can like help you, because I can tell you've been sitting for 8 hours and really bored. But like, I think young people, like all of us, can get more integrated in volunteering and voting, like supporting, even maybe running for office from our community.
I think our associate pastor, Pastor David, didn't you work as a poll worker?
Oh, yeah. So
so
he
that
can
was cool.
share his
So
own
he can
experience.
Yeah.
Love that.
I didn't know this either, but apparently Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial minority in our country. Yeah. I didn't know that. And in terms of civic engagement, kind of consistently ranking the lowest in terms of civic engagement. So I think what you're saying is really important. Not just Andrew Yang, people like Andy Kim over in Jersey.
Yes.
So it's been encouraging to see. You know, he's a dad of sons like me. So just kind of, I'm like, whoa, someone like me is out there. So.
And his district is mostly white. It's
Yeah.
not mostly Asian American,
Right.
and he became a Congress member. And to your point about Asian Americans being the fastest growing ethnic minority in the country, in a lot of swing states, the Asian American voting bloc determines the election, whether Stacey Abrams wins or Brian Kemp in Georgia, for example. I'm from Georgia, so I just like follow Georgia politics very closely. But Asian American, the vote has made such a determining factor. Even in New York City and Queens, we've had 4 Republican former city council seats flip, 3 or 4 in Queens, to Democrats, or so from Democrat to Republican, and it was because the Republican Party made a concerted effort to mobilize and engage the Chinese immigrant vote, and they flipped because they're mostly independent. So it's just, we're a very powerful force if we use it. Like, we are the women and men. Yeah. We just need to know our superpower.
And then I think one more thing on representation too, because I agree with you. It's important that I know I feel a particular kind of way when I see people who share my similar experience, whose names are on the ballot too, right? Yeah. And I'm also clear that that's always not enough. Yeah. And so, and also, I don't always want to see like the black folks that are representing the black district, right? Yeah. And so, which is why I won't say any names because whatever, but some people running in certain places makes me excited because who they would be representing is not folks of their same ethnic or racial background. Yeah. And I think that that's important too. And so while I think representation is important, as one of my good people will say, all skin folks are not kin folk. Yes. And so we also need to go to that next level and think about, okay, this person who shares my ethnic and racial background, the same person who grew up in the same place that I grew up in, got it. Yeah. Are we on the same level when it comes to values? Yes. Are we on the same level when it comes to what we see as like the fiduciary responsibility of this particular wing of government? Are we on the same page when it comes to waste management? do you believe that climate change is real? Like, there's a list of different
Yes.
things that we need to go through. So I
Yes.
think representation is one of them, and we still get to seek out more to make sure that there's also a values alignment as well, not just we have the same racial or ethnic background.
No, I agree. And I think that was my point about Andrew
yeah.
Yang, too. I was like,
Clear.
great that he's out there helping get the vote out, even if I won't vote for him. But that's, that not all skin.
Well, either
Very
way,
careful.
like you get to exercise your power to say one way or the other whether or not you want to have Andrew Yang or not. But
Yes.
so there's a question that came in that's similar to a question I wanted to ask as a follow-up as well. That understanding being a Christian voter requires us to be informed and engaged, but when does that identity substantively affect how we vote? So to that question, and actually to all three of you, I guess it would be, so, okay, we registered to vote, we know our vote is important, we know it matters, we know we can make a difference. I've done my research now, I'm on these websites, I've gone to town halls. What then? Like, so now I have this information, how do I use that then to make my decisions? Like, where does your Christian identity then kind of come in, or the values kind of come in as you're trying to make a decision about voting? Maybe, I don't know if any of you guys want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say two things. I think one is the values piece, right? So it is about the values alignment matchup. And then I think the second piece is that it doesn't stay with us, right? And so, like, even the information today, it's great that people take it with you. It's bad if it stays with you, right? So you should be sharing this information out. And I think that's also something that we get to do, like, within our communities, especially within communities that we're calling our Christian communities. Like, how is it that we're taking this knowledge beyond the folks who are in this room? And that's also a part of our work, too.
Yeah. Actually, another follow-up question that kind of came in that's, I think, along the lines of that. So now we have the information, we're taking it out, we want to share it with others. Someone did ask, how can we have edifying conversations with our fellow Christian brothers and sisters when there's differing political views? How do you kind of engage in those kinds of conversations?
I think that's something that Christians can really make a difference in the discourse that isn't happening, the social and political discourse. Like, I'm even thinking about the really heightened conversation about Israel and Palestine and the violence that's been taking place there, and all of the posts on social media about it. What does it look like to love our neighbor well, and who are we as Christians to respond to that? And I think I am obsessed with social media because, like, they have a hold on me. I think it's a really bad addiction of mine that I'm trying to quit. But I've noticed the social media posts, especially like Instagram stories and like the reels about this, it's very extremist in how people are responding, and there isn't an opportunity to just have a nuanced conversation about this very historical, like, difficult issue that most people are not experts on, but somehow all these corporations are putting out statements that have nothing to do with the Israel-Palestine situation. But I think what we can do as Christians is, like, in our church circles, in our small group, like side conversations, like while you're getting food, have a conversation and talk about, like, what's really going on and how is it affecting you. Like, the last couple of nights I've had dinner conversations with friends who are Jewish American and Asian American, and I was there just to learn. Like, I'm not from the Palestinian community, I'm not from the Jewish American community. So I asked the questions like, I see that there's a lot of, like, violence and innocent people are dying. Like, what can I do and be informed to learn on what to say? So I've just, like, refrained from posting anything on social media and trying to just have more dialogue and discourse, because things are so nasty and it just feels like cancel culture everywhere. On social media and even on blogs and, like, opinion pieces and mainstream news sources. So I think Christians have, like, a really important role to have civil discourse on very differing opinions, right?
Yeah, yes. And I really appreciate you, Grace. I just want to just underline some of the things that you said, because there was just so much in there, right? And I think the first thing is important, but it's hard because it can have a hold on a lot of us, is to resist the urge to find the right thing to post, right? And instead kind of ground yourself in what you know and don't know and start from there. Because from some people, they couldn't find Palestine or Israel or Jordan or Libya, like pick a country on a map up until a few days ago, right? So ask yourself, why now are you drawn into it? And use that as a point for you to do some learning before you decide that you've got the right words to put on a post. And then talk with people, right? Like, I don't ever want to be the person who posts something that's not about my experience, that I have not researched, that I have not asked my neighbor, a friend, or a colleague about, right? And so I think it's also like what you talked about, like an opportunity to talk with people and to do more listening than speaking, right? And someone who you're talking to over dinner, over tea, they're going to know your heart in a different way than the person who's scrolling through your feed, right? And so if you say something wrong, you're gonna know that you said something wrong in a different way, that it's still a space for you to be open and connected with that person, versus you've said something wrong and you've posted it, and how you're gonna get feedback from people that you've said something wrong or said something based off of little to no information, right? And so I think it's super important for us to also like be about like that sitting at the foot of the person who knows, who is directly connected to that experience, and as many different people as you're able to have an understanding of what is happening. And not just with this particular issue, but with other issues as well, right? Like, if I were somebody who had no work directly with young people and I'm sitting on the stage speaking on behalf of young people, I haven't been young in over 20 years. So, you know, what does that say? I'm young in heart. That is an issue for me, right? And so I would need to make sure that I'm in community with young people and that folks are okay with me saying something on their behalf before I take a microphone and say, this is what young people want today, you know? And so it's an opportunity for us to sit, for us to listen, for us to do our own research, and to really ask ourselves really hard questions about why it's important to us, and how is it that we're gonna show up in this way, and what other things might we be overlooking that's happening in our own neighborhoods, in our own families, in New York, that we need to address. Because if folks are frustrated and upset and are, frustrated and upset about the crises that we are seeing, there are other crises that are happening here in New York. And not as a comparison, but I think it's an opportunity to ask yourself why something is pulling you in one way and something that's happening in your backyard is not necessarily having the same pull. So I think, again, to like resist the urge to respond on social media, resist the urge to edit the company statement, and see where there is space for you to have a grounded, open conversation with somebody who is also willing to take the risk with you, right? Because, you know, it's a really challenging topic to have a conversation with people about, especially if folks have family members in Jordan, in Palestine, in Israel. And so for them to be willing to sit and to talk with you, knowing that you can step on something that becomes a trigger for them emotionally, you get to like respect that that is a space that you're walking into, and also be ready to be responsible when you're the person who says the wrong thing, right? And so I think it also allows for us to be in a space to think about like our relationships and the work that we owe ourselves to do before we have those conversations, whether it's on social media or one-on-one with people in our, you know, intimate communities.
Yeah, thank you all so much. To emphasize the importance of really kind of like listening to, not just kind of speaking or saying your opinion, but being able to kind of be that informed individual. I think it was like really important for us to make sure that we were giving really kind of practical information to folks about how to vote and to make a plan and things like that. And I saw that one of the questions was wanting to make sure that they had like practical tips step by step on that. So I don't know if I think we kind of went into it a little bit, but were there any other questions, or there was someone who had indicated that they wanted some more specifics? Yeah, did you want to go ahead?
Well, I just want to ask I know specifics are hard, but someone who just met my dad or goes on a Twitter page and gets a list of who to vote for, I'd love to know how the panelists make decisions. I heard about values. It's do you write a list of your values and the values of the politician and then see if they match up? How do you actually, I feel like my decision making isn't that sophisticated, so I don't know how to, I'd love to know how you all make those decisions and how you ingest the news and information and do so. And do you have to go to every town hall to vote? Can you not go to town halls and still have a formed opinion? You know what I mean? Just would love to know that.
I am not always the most educated voter either, even though I work in politics, to be honest. And it's not as methodical. What was your name again? June. I think what you're talking about of writing your values down and seeing if they align, that's a good idea. I think I should do that. I don't do that at all. I think for me, because maybe because my everyday life is just in politics, but I tend to see what people are saying and seeing how they vote and then what they do. And honestly, I really look at how people treat their community members and their staff too, in addition to whatever talking points or rhetoric is too. So that informs a lot of my decisions, especially for higher level offices, because that's a little more obvious, for mayor, for Congress, for president. A lot of that, you can find that out even just Googling and seeing how people treat their staff or other colleagues. You can see videos, social media posts. I think for city council members, especially if you let's say you live in LIC, Julie Wan is so accessible. You can go to her district office and just get to know her, or go to any of her public events and just have a conversation with her and ask the things that really matter to you. Let's say, June, you care about about having more park spaces in your neighborhood. You can ask Julie, what are you doing in order for our community here in Sunnyside to have more green spaces and park areas so that our families are safer? And if she doesn't have an informed decision or doesn't care for it, then you can be okay, this person is not the person I want to vote for. So I think that is how I make my decisions too. And honestly, it's also just talking to friends and asking them for their thoughts too. But you don't have to go to every single town hall. Even just going to one is helpful. But a lot of it, you can also see what is posted on Twitter, on Instagram, and then you can look at their press releases. That's a quick way to learn about what the elected officials' policy priorities are or resource priorities, and then see if it aligns with your values. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Yeah.
Do you live in New York City? Okay, awesome. So there's a website called nycvotes.org that is a non-partisan website that I think does a good job of breaking things down from how do I find where my voting site is. You can go there and you can see what's on the ballot. So if your particular district is going to have a particular proposition, you can read it in advance, so the first time that you see it is not when you actually go to vote. So that's a great resource, and it does actually what you're talking about, which is it does a list. So it'll have a list of okay, this particular candidate who's running for office, this is a statement about what they think about climate change. This is a statement about what they think about housing, education. So there are lots of places that already have these kind of lists, value to value by candidates, that you can look up as a guide. So some of the work is already done for you. Yeah. But I definitely think knowing for yourself is also important too. There are lots of different organizations that organize people, and so unions is one of them. So the teachers union in New York's teachers union actually is one of the largest unions in the country. And so the unions, they make a decision around who they think is going to best favor education as an example, or plumbers and electricians as another example, or transit workers as an example. And they'll say to their union members, here's how we want all of our union members to vote, right? And so there are times when I'm at the poll site where somebody will come in and I hear them like repeating to themselves the phrase that their union person told them about, so that they can remember what to do when they go to the ballot and they actually see their actual page, right? So nycvotes.org is a great website that does some of that, giving you a sense of who candidates are. So if you can't get to their debates, or you can't get to read press releases, that's a great resource. If you're in Jersey, the New Jersey Board of Elections website is actually really cool, and I'm not sure why New York's is not better, but it's also, you know, it's not one way or the other. It's nonpartisan, so if you're in Jersey, New Jersey's Board of Election website is accessible. It's easy to find what you need to find. It also has a section for you to look at your ballot in advance, for you to figure out what your polling site is for early voting, as well as on that general Tuesday. So a lot of things are kind of laid out for you in that format. And I think if you do have like the extra time to go check something out, if there is, like you were saying, Grace, like so many city council members, as an example, have newsletters that go out. Some city council members do like a weekly newsletter or like a monthly one. My favorite city council member is not the one that represents me. And so I sign up to that person's newsletter so I can find out what's happening in and around my neighborhood. And a couple of weeks ago, when all of the flooding happened and we looked like one big toilet bowl, I got an alert from my favorite city council person, who is not my city council person, on resources to take care of the flooding that my parents were experiencing. And so that same day, I was able to go through the mess to get some things that my parents needed for free so that they could be okay, and if they experienced flooding again, they would be all right. Till this day, I have not gotten an update message from my representative about what the impact was to my neighborhood.
Which is telling about who to vote for on election day.
Listen,
Then.
don't get me started. But there are some city council members who, I won't tell you who, but Queens, Bronx, Manhattan, I have city council members that I follow, and I get their newsletters. And for me, it's a way to like stay informed of about what's happening around the city, not just Brooklyn, which is where I live. And so that can be great too. And so there's a ton of newsletters that I get. I won't say anything because nobody's paying me to give them a shout out, but I like them. I read when it's not recording. And you know, it's like I get my little business newsletter so I can feel like I'm informed about what's happening and I know what the bros are talking about, right? So then that's my thing. I get another newsletter that like kind of lets me know about like what's happening in philanthropy. I get another, and so it does take work, and you do have to decide that you're gonna make the time to do it. But once you do, you kind of get into the rhythm of it, just like you have your own rhythms right now. So it takes a little bit for you to like get the groove, but once you do, it becomes a part of your routine, and you realize, oh, I am more informed than I was because I started doing these couple of new things differently, and that has made the difference. So you don't necessarily need to revamp everything that you're doing and watch, you know, every news from A to Z from 6 to 11, but there are probably one or two things that you can do that will help you be more informed that you are now, specifically as it relates to who represents you.
I mean, you can start here, the register to vote QR code that Young created, because it goes directly to the New Jersey voting website as well as the nycvotes.org that
So
Cidra
to that point too, there was a question about resources as well. So on the handout, that QR code actually links to a page that has several links, including the one that Cidra just mentioned, and a couple others that our guest speakers had recommended for everyone. And so we'll also make sure that's up on the Exilic Justice Ministry webpage as well. But if you don't have a handout, you can grab one. I think it's by the snacks table. That has a bunch of like links to resources as well that would be like helpful for folks, or that our speakers have kind of determined would be helpful for folks. I do want to be like mindful of time, so I'm going to ask like one last question of the speakers and ask them to just give like a short answer, and then they have all agreed to kind of stay after. So if you had more questions and wanted to ask anything, feel free to stay. But you know, for folks that might be reluctant to vote, maybe still here, they're not fully convinced, or you know, you have friends that are kind of reluctant to vote. Oh, does my vote really matter? It seems like such a pain. That seems like so much work. Could each of you maybe just speak like very briefly as to like, you know, a short tidbit of recommendation for how to encourage people to vote? I know we spent the entire hour kind of talking about why it's important, but kind of to distill it down and summarize it so that we have kind of some takeaways other than just everyone should become a poll worker, which I think was the other main takeaway, and that also Asian bros really can go out there and mobilize. I feel like those are the two that I kind of came away with, but Asian ladies, let's represent. Let's show what we can do. But you know, so as a parting kind of before we leave, let's, you know, to instill in some people's brains, like maybe, you know, one or two kind of just quick points about why it's important to vote, why we should be encouraging others to, why it's important, or kind of however you guys feel about it.
I'll go, because I'm going to quote Pastor Jean. Oh, wait a minute. Here we go. I think you can quote Pastor Jean, whether you're talking to your Christian friends or not, that voting allows for the opportunity to make sure you have folks who are representing you that are wielding power well, right? And I think that'll land with somebody who considers himself Christian or not. I think the other thing is to make the space and the time to do it, right? And in the same ways that we make space and time to like go to brunch with folks or go catch a game, like make a plan for people in your life to like, hey, this is a day we can all go vote together. You know, who's going to vote on Saturday? Let's go vote on Saturday, because then Tuesday we can just chill and not have to worry about long lines, right? You can say, hey, to an elder in your family, I have this Saturday free in advance. Let's put it on the calendar, and I'm going to take you, and we can go together, and we can vote together, right? Or you can babysit for somebody, say, oh, I'll have the kids for you on this day so you can go vote because I have these 9 other days that I can go vote, right? So I think making the time to make a plan allows people to feel like it's doable because you have a plan and you scheduled it, and now all you have to do is to go do it. And then again, like I was saying earlier, right, to have people think about what it means for their day-to-day. What does it mean for their day-to-day commute? What does it mean for their day-to-day livelihood? What does it mean for their neighborhood and what they get to experience by voting?
I guess I can go and then Grace, you can finish. I think as Christians, what we want is we want to love the things that God loves, and we know that God loves America. Not that God loves America more than the other nations of the world, but God loves the people of this country, and we know that Jesus had a very special place in his heart for the least, the last, and the lost in particular. And one way that we can love our neighbors is not just through one-to-one, but also through the vote. We can really not just use the vote so that my interests are met, but we can really think as Christians about the interests of others. So it's another way, it's another avenue for us, not just to be about, as Pastor Aaron said in the sermon today, me-centered, but you-centered. And that's really the posture of the Christian, and that we can really demonstrate through our civic engagement. So I think it's a unique opportunity that we have as Christians, not just to Christianize or spiritualize everything, but just in the world to love our neighbors. This is a great way that we can do it.
Amen. That was such a good word. You should have ended. I'm a PK, so I'm just gonna roll with the pastor and share a verse that my husband shares a lot. So Isaiah 9:6 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." I think at the end of the day, when we think about civic engagement and voting and making sure we love our neighbors well, God is sovereign, Jesus is sovereign, he is Lord, and the government, our elected officials, our mayor, our congressperson, our president, our city council people, it all rests on God's shoulders. And so remembering that whoever you vote for, don't think of it as being like, this is life or death, like I voted for the wrong person. At the end of the day, God is sovereign and the government rests on his shoulders. So just try to do your best to make an educated decision on who to vote for on November 5th. And if you make mistakes, that's okay. There's an election every year. Like next year's a presidential election, and you become a little more informed. And if there are candidates that you're not sure about, for me, if I'm not sure about a judge, I just don't vote for that section, and that's okay. If there's a proposition you're not sure about, just don't vote. You don't have to circle every single section. So just want to encourage that as Christians, we can rely on God's sovereignty, and that we will do the best we can to love our neighbors really well through voting, but at the end of the day, God is sovereign and he will take care of our community and our city. Yeah.
Amen. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. So yeah, for in the interest of time, we'll wrap up here. But just wanted to say thank you again so much to our special guests for coming and sharing your experiences and your encouragement. And hopefully this was helpful for folks. Again, the QR code and the resources will be on our webpage. And I think everyone's willing to kind of stay after for a bit. If you guys had any more questions that we weren't able to address, please do feel free to do that. There's also tons of snacks, so make sure you eat them or take them with you. So thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.